And I compromised, and I made it so that we could. Yes.
Nothing over there.
Huh?
I'm kidding.
Why not have so much power?
I'm kidding. I was kidding with Rachel. I said
Okay, let's go. Hey, quiet down. I know you're filled with the yummy goodness of today's lunch, but process that. Now, I want to finish this up. I need I don't know 10, 15 here just to get finished up. And from what I understand, we should be through this point. So on your packet here, we're certainly on the back page. We're in that Kansas Nebraska Act box. And I want to kind of just a real quick review start here. We've got this individual, Stephen Douglas. We've got this chunk of land here in the pinkish orange that we haven't really done anything with since we bought it for the Louisiana Purchase. And so Douglas has this idea that we will be able to get the railroad through Illinois if we can promise that railroad that they'll be able to continue straight across to California. But before we can do that, we've got to organize this territory. I think we have to understand this. That is really the only goal of this legislation. Now, yesterday I described this as the second of two big bombs that go off that take a lot of, especially Northerners, from feeling like, well, slavery stinks. Maybe we'll just try to focus on keeping it down here, not letting it expand. There's a couple of bombs that go off that really harden Northern feelings to say, screw that. It's time for us to actually take the battle in and bring an end to slavery as quickly as we possibly can. The first, we talked yesterday about the Fugitive Slave Act, and when the realities of that become obvious to Northerners, it really is a slap in the face for a lot of those people. This is the other big bomb. Now, I had somebody ask me this morning when we started, they said, look, I guess I get why the popular sovereignty part of this, that might tick a few people off, but you can't compare this to the Fugitive Slave Act. Why on earth does this make so many people mad that it's at the same comparison as something as just nasty as the Fugitive Slave Act? Well, it's not the law itself that sets off the bomb. All that Douglas is trying to do here is put a couple territories together so the trains can go through. Right, whatever. That's not a huge deal. The problem is it really does come back to this part. Once we organize these territories, we're going to let the people that live there decide, let them vote on whether or not they're going to be free or whether they're going to allow slavery. So this really, I think, it becomes a battleground, a first battleground for free versus slave. And we're going to see Northerners move into that area, not to live there, but to try to coerce, influence, push Kansans, especially it seems, to vote, let's go free. And then the Southerners are going to do the same thing, coerce, influence, and push Kansans to vote slave. It's that sets off this bomb. Right? So we're going to go to that, what happens there next. I did want to point out, though, and this is all coming out of 1854, so we're about 7 years away from a Civil War. In 1804, we have an election. Now, it's not a presidential election. It's not a presidential. It's like what we're getting ready to have next week, where you're voting for senators, you're voting for congressmen. In that election, we have a new political party that is being born. So here we've got question 3 under Kansas-Nebraska Act here. What new political party is born? It is the Republican Party. Now, we used to have the Democratic Republicans. Let's not get them confused. That's not who we're talking about here. At this point, the Democratic Republicans have become the Democrats. I know that's weird. Right? And we have a new party here that is going to be called the Republican Party. From this point forward, this country will be Democrat versus Republican. Now, the points and the views and all of that have flipped in some ways, but this is where that whole thing begins. This Republican Party is created with one purpose in mind. One purpose. This is a party created to oppose slavery, and I think that should tell us something. I think that should tell us, be a sign to us that the battle lines are really hardening here. I mean, we have a political party forming, and they only have one goal in mind, and that is to be the political party that brings an end to slavery. So, try to keep that in mind as we go forward. Now, we've got this set up. We have a battleground setting up in Kansas. Will Kansas go free, or will it go slave? This is your knockout fight. And so we're going to see groups moving into Kansas to try to push people to vote one way or the other. The group that gets there first and puts the initial on the Kansans are the groups that are pro-slave. And I think why do they get there first? Well, it's because they're closest. Okay? Kansas shares a border with a state called Missouri. And Missouri, if we can remember, is Missouri free or is it a slave state? It's slave. Remember, that's the Missouri Compromise. Missouri and Maine had to come in together. Maine was going to be the free. Missouri was going to be the slave. So Missouri is slave. They've got this neighbor now across the border who is trying to vote on whether to be free or slave. And so we're going to see groups of Missourians cross the border, and they're going to try to push Kansans to vote to go slave. Now, these are not nice people. Okay, these are best, I think, described as gangs. And as you can tell, this is a primary document up here. Okay, we don't have a ton of photographs. We're starting to get into that. But in 1854, not a ton. So we have a lot of artists going out there and drawing what they see. So this actually ran in an Eastern newspaper. I think it was out of Boston, if I remember right. So this is depicting what's going on in Kansas. And other than just the guys themselves, what do you notice about the image? John? Yes. What? Yeah, I mean, they're well armed. I think that's pretty obvious. These come to be known as the Border Ruffians. They're really just armed gangs. And they're moving into Kansas to do one job, and that is, at the end of a gun, convince you as to why it would be in your best interest to vote for Kansas to become a slave territory. Okay? And I mean, it's a pretty convincing argument when you have a gun pointed in your face. You know, all of a sudden, slavery sounds pretty good. Now, the North isn't going to have this, right? I mean, they're not going to just let this go. All right, there's a lot of Northerners who get really fired up about this, but nobody from the North goes as far as a guy named John Brown. John Brown, I mean, here we've got a photograph of the guy. I think just by looking at the photograph, how might you describe what you think this guy is like? He looks, somebody said mean. Sure, you can pull that from that photo. Somebody said intimidating. Yeah, I think he just looks really intense. You know, I mean, he's not one to be messed with, and he really isn't. John Brown was originally, he's from the North, originally from Ohio. He was a guy at this point in time, he'd already had 20 children, and 9 of them, unfortunately, had passed away as children, whether, ages differed. But he's got several children still left, and a lot of them are boys, and all of his sons have been raised the same mentality, that there are 2 things, and 2 things only that matter. One is the Bible, and one is that slavery is evil. Now, initially, we might sit here and think, well, that doesn't sound that bad. There are an infinite number of different things that you could be raised hold up than those two things. The issue with that is that John Brown went so far as to say, those are the only two things you should care about, and you need to be willing to do whatever it takes to push those ideas. And if that includes murder, then that's what you got to do. I mean, it's like taking that, maybe it's a good idea, taking it right to that extreme, and that's always where we run into problems. So John Brown took several of his sons and a few other followers, and when he started hearing what these border ruffian gangs were doing, they armed up and they went to Kansas. And they ended up in a town in Kansas called Pottawatomie Creek. This was a known pro-slavery town. All right, there was no question how the folks in that town were going to vote. These were Kansans who were going to vote for slavery. And John Brown wanted to send a message. You look at the guy's quote. He wants to strike terror into the hearts of slavery supporters. When people go to vote on whether Kansas should be free or slave, he wants them to think Pottawatomie Creek. He wants that running through their head. So what they did is they rode into town. It wasn't a huge town. They grabbed 5 guys just from 5 different homes, 5 different families, pulled them out of their homes and into the street, down on knees, and each of those 5 were shot with a bullet to the back of the head. And then John Brown stepped up and pulled out a broadsword. I said this yesterday. I don't know if any of you ever seen Braveheart. I feel like that's the best example that I could give you of a broadsword. We're not talking about like a little fencing sword or something like that. A broadsword's got, it's a 2-handed sword. All right, these were created in the Middle Ages during the Crusades for you to mow down. This isn't, a nice little stab. This is go into battle and mow down as many people as you can with a sword. It's that kind of big. So John Brown pulls out a broadsword and hacks up the bodies with the broadsword. That's what he wants. Like he says, look, I am justified in doing this horrible thing because I want people to understand how far we're willing to go to bring an end to this evil. Now, how do most people generally react to a super extreme kind of character? Do they support? I think most people generally look at that and say, like, we agree with you, slavery is bad, but that's horror movie type stuff there, okay? So we're not doing that. So John Brown, as you might imagine, becomes, a man on the run. I think he really thought that everyone would just hail him as a hero and flock to John Brown, and he'd become the great hero of abolition. No. A few people loved the guy. Most people were really turned off by how far he was willing to go. But John Brown vanishes. Like, he has to get out of Dodge, or he's going to get arrested and something's going to happen. So he just vanishes. Nobody knows where he goes. He's just gone. All right? So, we'll find out what happens to him here in a few minutes. But for almost 5 years, he's gone. Nobody hears from him. We'll see what happens to him here in just a moment. All right? Now, this is bad. That's putting it mildly. But it is simply, I think, one example of different things that are going on in this country at this time that demonstrate to you, or at least they should, just how divided this country really is. Okay? Another good example, and notice that I gave you a question on the pack that says, other than what happened at Pottawatomie Creek, can you give me another example of something that demonstrates just how intense things are getting? Okay? So let me set the stage for you a little bit, because this is one of my favorite stories. It's pretty rough, but it's good. Yeah. So we got a guy. He's a United States Senator. You guys are all wondering what I'm about to do. All right, there's a guy who he's a United States Senator. His name's Charles Sumner. He's from Massachusetts. So is he going to be probably pro-slave, or freedom. Yeah, right. He's not a, he hates slavery. I mean, he actually, I think we could argue that he kind of burns with the same sort of passion that maybe a John Brown does. But instead of going around and hacking people up, Charles Sumner decides to use his voice. He's an incredible speaker. So he starts to stand up on the floor of the United States Senate and give these super passionate speeches about why slavery is an evil. And he goes as far as to say, look, if you believe in slavery, you're evil too. You go down south, anyone who believes in slavery, they are an evil. They are the problem. All right. So one day he's giving this speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Some of you went to D.C. in 8th grade, right? You've been to the Capitol building. That's where this all goes down. And while he's giving this speech, somebody from the House of Representatives, okay, Congress has two parts to it, right? So somebody from the other house, the House of Representatives, is walking by. His name is Preston Brooks. Now, Preston Brooks is from South Carolina. His family owns slaves. He's already pretty fired up and pretty tense about everything that's going on. As he walks by the Senate chambers, he hears Charles Sumner going on about how evil slavery is, how everybody who owns a slave is evil too. And Preston Brooks, as he described it himself, is filled with a rage, absolute rage. He loses it. Now, it was pretty common back then for a wealthy gentleman to walk around with a walking cane, the sign of wealth, stature. Preston Brooks was a gentleman, so he had a walking cane. And when he heard this, he burst open the doors of the Senate. He went running down, and he just took this cane, took him out. And when he got him on the ground, he just kept beating. Now, he didn't kill the guy, but from that point forward, Charles Sumner would talk with a lisp. He would not be able to walk without the aid of some sort of assistance. In fact, he spent a few years in a wheelchair because he couldn't walk around. I mean, this is a beating that he took. Now, that's bad enough. That's bad enough. What I think is interesting is how people react to this. Up north, Preston Brooks is looked at as, as you might imagine, a villain. You start to see cartoons like this published in northern newspapers. Now, how do we know? How do we know that this is pro-North, anti-beating? How do we know that from this?
Charles.
He looks helpless, sure. Yep. Exactly. I think the line there. Now it refers to chivalry. Does anybody know what chivalry is? Well, yeah, right. I mean, it's good manners. It's acting like a gentleman. You know, it's everything that would kind of go into that. And so what they're saying here is, like this is what Southern manners look like. This is what being a Southern gentleman looks like. You get angry, and so you beat somebody. And what I love is look what Sumner's doing. You see what he's defending himself with? Yeah, an inkwell. He's using his words. He's using his inside voice to defend himself, to stand up for what he believes. This guy's just coming down and beating him with a cane. Right? That's the point of view. Now, on the southern side of this, Preston Brooks, over the course of the next 4 months, received something like 400 canes that were mailed to his office from Southern supporters that wanted to send him a sign that they loved what he had done. That's where we are as a country, is that we've resorted, we've let this issue of slavery divide us so much that we have gone to the extremes of beating each other on the floor of the U.S. Senate, of broadsword hacking people. That's where we are as a country. So it should not surprise us that we are that close to war here. Right? All right, what we got left? Huh? How did he not get fired, Cole? Because this was actually much more common than you think. Congress is a pretty violent place. Actually, 5 years ago, the Speaker of the House, a guy named John Boehner, was put up against the wall by a knife by a fellow congressman. There was a guy, and I kid you not, this is only in America that this could happen. There was a guy in the mid-1850s, right around the same time this happened, who was known to not be messed with because he would walk around and he'd have it, he'd have his coat back so you could see it. On one leg was a Bowie knife. I don't know if you ever seen a Bowie knife. That's a big knife. And on the other side was called, what is called an usik. Anybody have any idea what an usik is? It's don't look it up on Google. Because Mr. Moorhead will want to have a talk with you. An usik it's a bone that comes from a whale's. Yes. Yes. So yeah. Anyway, he had that strapped to his side with a Bowie knife on the other. And if you messed with him, like he was known to, he'd just sit there and he'd just tap that Bowie knife just on the table. If he was sitting there in the Senate chambers, he'd sit there. Big Bowie knife. Yeah. We talk about it intimidating. He's going to get you with the giant bone thing. I don't know. So, okay. I was worried about bringing it. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of where we are. This is pretty common here. It's just I think this one captured the attention because it was a pretty epic beating. Like this guy got hit pretty hard. All right, I want to finish up here real quick here. I'll talk. I know Scott versus Sanford's on there. I'll come back to that here in a second. By the time we get to like the end of the 1850s, 1858, like this is where we are. We are as divided of a country as we have ever been until some would say right now. I don't know that we've gotten quite that far, but I mean we are divided. We are polarized. So 1858 is the last election before the Civil War is going to start. And I think probably the biggest thing that comes out of that election is that a certain American from Illinois is going to make his name. Right, guess who? It's not George. Now, we always say he's the man from Illinois. He's also the guy from Indiana. You guys are all aware that Abraham Lincoln grew up in Indiana. In fact, he didn't just grow up. It's not like he stopped and had a drink and then he moved on. He at the age you are right now, he was in Indiana. He moved here at the age of 6. Was here until up through his teenage years. He moved to Illinois after he was out of the house. So I mean, he spent a chunk of time in Indiana. But it always sort of bothers me that Illinois acts like they have claim over Lincoln. He was born in Kentucky, moved to Indiana, and then lived out the adult part of his life in Illinois. Now nobody really knows him though. At this point, he's a lawyer. He's got kind of a fun story. If you guys want to see something wild, and if I can, I'll find it for you. You ought to try to find a picture of Lincoln before the war, and then compare it to a picture of Lincoln right before he shot. War ages people, and it's remarkable when you look at it with Lincoln. Now, Lincoln steps forward, though, and he wants to be in the U.S. Senate. The only way that he's going to be able to get there is if he can beat our old buddy here, Stephen Douglas. And so what they decided to do, this was a time when politicians stood up and said, here's what I believe in, and here's why I think you should elect me, instead of running ridiculous campaigns. Where you're holding axes or wearing blue shirts or some nonsense. Politicians stood up and you voted for somebody because you wanted them to win, not the other guy to win. Lincoln and Douglas decide that they're going to stage a series of debates. You may have heard about these. They held a series of these around the state of Illinois. They would just go from town to town, build a big stage, and then Lincoln and Douglas would stand up. Now, Lincoln was 6'4". He's about my height. Stephen Douglas was 5'3". So right there, the visual is definitely going to be, very different here. But they were both incredibly skilled as public speakers. Now, Douglas was more of the, I'm gonna use, 1,000 words to say 10. Lincoln was much more of the, I can use 10 words to say 1,000. No, it's like the old Gettysburg Address story. You guys heard that story? Yeah. How many? Very short. Yeah, it's extremely short. 147. Yeah. 147 words that he wrote on the train on a napkin on his way to Gettysburg. Now, he was the second speaker that day at Gettysburg. All right? And the guy who spoke ahead of him was at that point in time, 1863, considered to be one of the greatest public speakers in the United States of America. He got first off, not the president. He stood up and he spoke for 2 hours. Spoke for 2 hours straight. Lincoln then stands up and speaks for about 3 minutes. When he sat down, that public speaker that spoke first said that Lincoln said more than 3 minutes than I could say in a year. Lincoln had that sort of talent. They got up. They gave these incredible debates. Some of these debates went on for hours. People flocked to these debates. Now Lincoln's not going to win this election. This is when Lincoln gets his name out there. That he's an incredible speaker. He really exudes leadership. And for the Republican Party, this is somebody that they're looking at. Somebody that they're going to keep an eye on. 1858. This is when Lincoln's going to make his name. All right. Last thing. The photograph that you see up here is of a small town in what today we would call West Virginia. But at the time, it was just Virginia. West Virginia splits from Virginia during the Civil War because folks on the western part of the state wanted to go free. They didn't want to go to the Confederacy, so they split off and made their own. So today you would find this in West Virginia. Now, there's kind of a sleepy little town. There's not much to it. The one thing, though, that it did have was that it had what we call an arsenal, a federal arsenal. What is that?
Stockpile of war weapons.
Yes, it's a big building with guns and ammo. And the Army had several of these set up around the country. You know, if they needed ammo, here you go. This is where we can leave leftover ammunition and guns. So in this arsenal, we have all these guns and all this ammo. One night, in October of 1859, so we're right up. A certain somebody, all of a sudden, resurfaces. Might that be? Our old buddy John Brown has come back. Nobody knew where he went after Kansas. Turns out, he hid out in the hills and mountains of Virginia. If you've ever been through Virginia, you know it's all hills and mountains. Very, very beautiful. I love Virginia. Yeah, especially. All right, so that's where John Brown's been hiding out now. He's been busy. He's gotten a whole lot more followers. He's got his sons with him. He's got this idea. He says, look, the only way we're ever going to get freedom for slaves is if they fight for it. So I am going to be the leader of a slave rebellion. And then when I start this thing, slaves are going to run off their plantations. They're going to join me. All I have to do is arm them, and we're going to have a war, and they will fight to be free. Now, in October of 1859, he'd gotten several escaped slaves to join him. He's well on his way. The only thing he's missing, guns and ammo. So he says, hey, there's an arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Let's go there. So one night, they sweep into Harper's Ferry. And they're actually pretty successful at this. They managed to take over that arsenal. And the word goes out. John Brown is instigating a slave rebellion. Slaves, leave your plantations, come to Virginia, find John Brown. He will arm you, and you will have a chance to fight for your freedom. No, doesn't go exactly as John Brown thought. Turns out the first people who get there is a United States Army regiment under the leadership of a colonel named Robert E. Lee. Just a colonel at that time. He shows up with his regiment. They take up firing positions. They ask for John Brown to surrender. He, of course, says no. And a firefight ensues between John Brown's people and Lee's regiment. And not surprisingly, Lee's regiment's going to win the day. A couple of John Brown's sons are killed. Several of the slaves who have joined him are killed. And John Brown survives, but is arrested. Now, technically, he has committed a pretty serious crime. Anybody know what crime that is? Bingo. Oh, say it again. Treason. And treason is a crime for which there is only one punishment. And that is death. Now, somebody suggested earlier this morning that he was beheaded. We've moved on from cutting people's heads off this morning. I know, I'm sorry. At this point, the method of execution is hanging. John Brown is tried for treason. He's convicted very quickly, and he is hung. And you would think that would be the end of John Brown. That is, I think we could argue that's the beginning of John Brown. John Brown becomes a martyr. What is a martyr? Somebody who through their death becomes a symbol for other people. Now, there were a lot of people who thought John Brown was way too extreme. But there were a lot of people up north who said at least he was willing to do something. He put his life on the line to free the slaves. One of those people was Frederick Douglass. I have him over here. He's one of my favorite historical figures. Frederick Douglass was not somebody who was going to endorse what happened at Pottawatomie Creek, but he was somebody that stood up and said, at least John Brown was willing to do something. He helped to advance this idea of John Brown as a martyr. Now, whatever you think, that's entirely up to you. But that's what happens. John Brown becomes a martyr. And, you had to kind of get the story of him out there, right? Get the story of John Brown out there. And in the 1850s, without television or radio or anything like that, a lot of times the way you got stories out was through song. How do you think so many slaves escaped from their plantations? They didn't know where to go. They didn't know which way north was. So they created songs like Follow the Drinking Brook. Music was a powerful tool for communicating a message that people wanted to hear. So one of the most popular songs of the early 1860s was a song called John Brown's Body. And I wanted to play it for you, right? Because I'd be willing to bet some of you have heard this song before. How many of you are in choir or have been in choir? All right. I'd be willing to bet some of you, if not all of you, have heard the song John Brown's Body. Let me play it for you. By the way, this is a painting done of the day that John Brown was hung. This was a painting that spread through the North quite a bit, really kind of tried to push this martyr image. It's based off of firsthand accounts that before he was hung, that he did kiss an African-American child on the forehead. It certainly perpetuates that image of a martyr. But like I said, there was a song called John Brown's Body. The version of this you're going to hear is from one of my favorite musicians, a guy named Pete Seeger. So it's going to have more of a modern folk feel to it, but you're going to be able to pick up on the music and recognize it, I think, fairly quickly. So this is John Brown's Body.
John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave.
You don't recognize it yet, you will in a minute.
Brown's body lies a mouldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
How many of you are already thinking, I've heard this somewhere before? Oh, yeah, right? I heard it, what? So now I already heard somebody say, we sing it different. We sing it, absolutely you sing it different. All right, it's become one of the great American, patriotic songs, right? But what had happened is that when Julia Ward Howe wrote the lyrics to a song called Battle Hymn of the Republic, she couldn't quite figure the tune out for the song. And she happened to be somewhere where they were playing John Brown's Body, and she said, that's it. And so what you guys are a little bit more used to is this version. This is the Marine Corps band.
eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is
Some of you may have sung this in church. We used to sing this in church. 4th of July or something.
His faithful light of his terrible swift sword.
All right, come on. Yeah. So this great American patriotic song that is sung in churches, and we used to sing it at the Veterans Day program here, was originally a song about a man's body rotting in his grave, serving as a martyr for anti-slavery. So, something to think about as you, you perform at the Veterans Day program. So, all right. With the exception of Scott versus Sanford, is there anything else as you look through that you feel like, no, I'm missing here, I didn't quite get, or had some questions on? Yeah. Okay. So the president's review on the back. I just kind of built that in because I want you guys to kind of keep reviewing those. I'm going to let you guys handle that on your own. If you did the president's timeline, you've got all but one of those. Lincoln is 16. So you can work your way back from Buchanan to Pierce and so on. But that's just kind of for you to fill in as we go. I'm not going to make these due until tomorrow. Yeah, okay. Other than Scott versus Sanford, is there anything else that you have questions on? Rachel? All right, so number one on the Compromise of 1850, the issues of admitting California as a state. Somebody help me out with an answer on this one. Raise your hand, Caleb. Exactly, right. We're worried that free states will outbalance slave states, and the South got angry about that. That's the big issue in bringing California in. Taylor?
I don't think I heard the result of the election.
That's Lincoln getting elected, right? Yeah, that's Lincoln getting elected. All right, what else? Scott versus Sanford. Yeah, I said other than Scott versus Sanford. Yeah, you're good. Other than Scott versus Sanford, anything else? Oh, we got a question.
Did Lincoln win or no?
What?
Did Lincoln win?
In 1860, he wins. That's when he becomes president. Anything else? Okay. Hey, let's answer the Scott versus Sanford question. Now, the reason why I kind of put this last was because we actually talked about this before, right? We talked about this when we did the president timeline. So this, it really ought to be a little bit of review, maybe one of these things where when I say a few things about it, it'll ring a distant, foggy bell, maybe, I don't know. But I've thought a lot about Scott versus Sanford recently, like the last 2 days. I've thought about Dred Scott a lot. Dred Scott was a slave. He was a slave, and he lived in Missouri. He was a slave in Missouri. Lived there. He was actually, I think in terms of being a slave, he was lucky in the fact that his wife was also on the same plantation with the same master. So his master took Dred Scott and his wife with him on trips to Illinois, on trips into Wisconsin, which of course is free land. And the master dies while they're up there. So Scott and his wife are just sort of there. Now, the easy thing for Scott and his wife to have done would have been to what? Right? Exactly. They were in Wisconsin. I mean, how close are you to the Canadian border? They could have ran it. They could have ran it. But instead, Dred Scott and his wife decided that they would do what he considered to be right and return to their plantation. Now, they weren't going back to that plantation so that they could go back to become slaves. There were laws in place in the North that said if you were a slave and you were willingly brought to northern free land, that action on its own made you. Did that happen for Dred Scott? No question. No question about it, right? His wife, he and his wife were brought to Illinois, brought to Wisconsin, free territory, right? I mean, there's no question about it. So Dred Scott and his wife went back to their plantation to basically say, bye, Felicia. I'm free. We're free. Just wanted to say adios. When they got back to that plantation, though, his master's widow, her brother, were ready. Decided, no way, we're bringing you back into bond. So Dred Scott decided that, I mean, this was a pretty smart guy. He actually decided that he was going to use the law and sue for his freedom. And he ends up taking this case to the United States Supreme Court. It still kind of blows my mind that Dred Scott was even able to get the case that far. But he did. Now, what sickens me about this case, that Dred Scott shows up, and before he can open his mouth, he's told, don't even start. We look at you, we don't see a citizen of this country. We don't see an American. And those are the only people who can argue, bring a lawsuit for the United States. When we look at you, we don't see a citizen. We don't see an American. We do not see a person. I think it does if you understand racism. That's really what's coming through. Is the United States government telling him, as a slave, you are not the same value. And he ends up going back. Now, it ends with a somewhat happy ending. He does eventually get his freedom, buys it. Buys his freedom for he and his wife. He does die a free man. But the point, the principle of it is that this man, that's where we were in 1857. We still had that attitude that existed. Thought a lot about him over the last couple of days. It's a pretty low point. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. You know, we're low on time. I get rolling on story time, and I lose focus. So instead of starting this the Civil War video, we'll start that tomorrow. If you want to take some time and get that president's review done, you can go ahead and turn it in before you go. You do still have like 9 minutes here, and then you're done. All you got to do is give me the name of the president in order, 1 through 16. You know, party in here, you're good to go. If not, you need to bring this back tomorrow, first thing, and put it in the basket. It is for points, and then you will get it back for you to be able to use on future quizzes and things like that. Right? So if you want to finish that up, get that done, you can get it turned in. Otherwise, bring it back tomorrow.
Wait, is it for you? No.
Did not have a fire. He was part of the me party. I am me. Yeah.
Somebody yell for me.
7. He is a Democrat.